So good evening, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jan René Larsen, and I'm co-chairing this session. It's the top of the hour now, but I would like to give people a minute or two before we start. We're a small group, so we can have a focused discussion, but start in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Yeah, so again, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jan René Larsen, and I'm the co-chair for this working group and for this session. This is a joint session where Working Group 5 are inviting people from other groups to join us. Before we go into the meeting, I would like to introduce the other co-chair for Working Group 5, Peter Schlosser. And maybe Peter, yeah, we've seen you at different occasions here, but maybe just say a few words about yourself for those of you who don't know you.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last time. Introduction?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Peter Schlosser. I'm at Arizona State University. I'm co-chair of Working Group 5, as Jan René already said, and I'm also co-chair of the executive committee of the organizing committee for the AOS. I have been with the Arctic Observing Summit process since the first one was held in Vancouver in 2013.
Thank you. And we have the people that helps us with the session have changed in the last minute. So we have two roles. We have a tech person and we have a chat monitor. And since things have changed so rapidly, could the two of you please introduce yourself? And I know that the chat monitor has this special assignment on the script that we have.
Okay. Hello, I'm helping with your technical. I'm Jennifer. There we go.
And sure, my name's Mike DeLue. I'm going to be the chat monitor for this session. And I have a little bit of a script here for us to start out with. The circumpolar Arctic is the contemporary home to many different indigenous peoples. As researchers and others who are working in or reside in the Arctic, we recognize these lands and waters as the mostly unceded traditional homeland of the indigenous peoples. It is the responsibility of each of us to learn, know, and gain better understanding of the indigenous people and cultures with which we engage. With that in mind, let's engage in an open-minded community building collaboration as described by the ASSW Code of Conduct, which we will share in the chat window after I'm done here. Some logistics before we start. You joined with your camera off and your audio muted. If you unmute yourself at any time, please remember to remute yourself after speaking. The mute button is in the bottom left-hand corner of your chat window, and if you're on the phone, it should be *6. Please keep yourself muted at all times. We can hear your typing and other conversations when you're not muted. And if you have the option, please use headphones and a headset when your microphone is open so that we don't get echo and feedback. See your controls by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen. You can chat and see other participants via these controls. If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat window and they'll be read aloud. If you need help, message the moderator via the chat tool or the raise hand tool, which is accessed by opening the participant window. And you can unmute yourself to speak up or raise your virtual hand and we'll call on you in order to keep the conversation in a reasonable way. If you don't have a mic, type yourself into the chat and the chat monitor, that's me, will read questions out loud, also for the folks on the phone. And this presentation is being recorded. A video file, audio file, slides, and relevant links will be available on the agenda tab of the AOS website, and the video will be available on YouTube at some time in the near future. Thank you so much, and I will throw it back to Jan René.
Yeah, thank you. And since we are such a small group, maybe just a few words of introduction from the rest of the people there. I take them in alphabetic order. We have Anna Gebrook. Maybe you'd like to say a few words about yourself.
Hello, I'm volunteer for Work Group 1, and I am a PhD student and benthic ecologist based in the University of Edinburgh. My preliminary interests are in long-term dynamics of macrobenthic communities in the Arctic and distribution of microplastics and invasive species. Yeah.
Welcome, Heike, you're with us as well.
Yes, good evening. So my name is Heikki Liavainen and I'm from Svalbard Integrated Arctic Earth Observing System.
Yeah, thank you. Molly McCammon, please.
Yeah, this is Molly McCammon. I'm director of the Alaska Ocean Observing System based in Anchorage, Alaska.
Thank you. And Srita, you're with us as well.
Hi, this is Shweder from SciOS based in Svalbard.
Yeah, thank you. And finally, Vito Vitale.
Yeah, Vito Vitale from Italy, Sionara, and all a very specific cap apart to be a person that like to work in polar regions and enthusiastic about the Arctic and try to bring Italy in the game.
Thank you, Vito. The way we've been working, or the way we've been working within this working group until now, is that earlier today we had a session where, as one of the first things, we reviewed the terms of reference or the charts for this working group. We had Sandy Starkweather with us, who went through a presentation that some of you may also have seen, and I just wanted to highlight a few things from that presentation. The heading is the same roads process that is driving the Arctic Observing Summit, and one point here is that it should complement and integrate without duplication the current planning approaches used by existing efforts, regional and global. And that speaks to the title of our working group, is that we want to see Arctic observing in the light of global observing. And the point here is that we want to complement and integrate that. We are not interested in any duplications. Another aspect that is highlighted here is that the roads process should bring us towards robust collaborative communities of practice to define and integrate observing system, best practices and requirements. And that again points to the fact that the Arctic is not alone. Many regional and global initiatives are also in the business of defining processes for integrated observing, and we should learn from these. And she also outlined this overview of the charges to the different working groups, and the first one on assessing impactful essential Arctic variables applies to to our group, and that does not mean that we will make these long shopping list of essential variables, but our assignment will be to discuss and define the assessment process out of the many variables or processes that could be observed. How do you assess the most impactful? We learn from other initiatives to do that. And as the second one, we have recommended a schema for structure coordination, and the schema in this context means a framework, a set of documentations where we can record requirements, assessment structures around each of these variables. Again, many initiatives are doing this already, and the idea is to learn from these. And then it also reads that our working group is about inclusive engagement strategy, expert panels, meaning that, again, we want to engage with existing strategies. We are proposing a structure with a number of expert panels, and also, as the last row here says, advisory panels, where each of the expert panels work with specific essential variable or a small group of these, while the advisory panels are those that you could say have the complete overview of what's going on in the expert panels and bring the advice to a higher level. And the way we have been working with these charges is that we have, as a beginning and as a preparation for this, asked a number of regional and global initiatives to create overviews of what they are already doing and get an idea to learn from that. So today we had presentations from 3 regional initiatives and 1 global initiative. The global initiative was WMO, while the regional initiatives was Eurogoose, who's a regional goose organization based, covering Europe and engaged in ocean observing. We had a presentation by Heikki Lihavinen from SIAS, who is also with us today. SIAS is the Svalbard Integrated Observing System, and he told us about how they have been collecting the many nations that are doing observing in Svalbard and streamlining their observational efforts. And finally, as the 3rd regional initiative, we had Molly McCammon from the AOS, the Arctic Ocean Observing System, which gave us a quite comprehensive overview of the many observing activities that they have, but also the efforts that they have to make all of the observations into useful societal products and services that serves the societal purpose. And this is more or less what we have reached today. In our coming days, we will look more closely into how is this assessment process going to be organized within the ROADS process, and we'll also seek to have a closer. We'll also seek to develop an engagement strategy where we can make sure that all initiatives that can inform and help the ROADS process are engaged and offer their support. So this is to summarize what we had done. We had envisaged that this would be more of a Q&A session, where perhaps people that come from some of the other working groups would have questions or have specific interest in what we're doing, or would even want to be engaged in developing this framework for doing the assessment of essential Arctic oceans. So I think I'll stop here, but also ask Peter Schlosser, the other co-chair, if you have something to add to the status where we are now.
No, I think you laid out what has, what the goals are, what has happened so far. This morning session, I don't know, somehow for those of you who were on that, it got cut off at some point, and I think there was an attempt to re-establish it through another link. So I just got about half of Rodika's presentation, or whatever it was, 2/3, something like that. I assume that will be posted somewhere, or
I spoke with her afterwards, and we simply agreed that she would redo the last 5 minutes or something like that of her presentation when we convene tomorrow, because I think that some of the interesting things were also there towards the end of their existing structures. So we can.
Yeah, and if we have a different membership, we can decide that probably on the spot tomorrow. If there are other people logging in, maybe she can go through in a short version through her presentation. But then I do agree that this session probably would be best used. The time in this session would be best used if we would have an exchange about ideas, concepts, questions that people have, and input from other working groups. That would also be really valuable.
Yeah, sure. The floor is open. Anyone, please please chime in. We are so few. I know there is a raise hand function. I don't think we have to need it. We'll probably manage. So we are so few. So anyone who has comments, interest, questions in what we're trying to achieve here, please please speak up and let's have a dialogue on this.
And until we have the first hands raised, one observation I made this morning was that, you know, there are different philosophies about observing. There are these essential variables approach where programs try to come up with what do they really want to observe, and then there is a big discussion about priorities, and then exactly where will they taken, at which position, how often, all that kind of stuff. And then there is another philosophy that we actually discussed early on in Arctic observing, because it's it's typically not domain driven, but it's a holistic approach and observing system across all domains. And that is to observe to address certain themes or problems or processes. And that, for example, the Arctic Ocean Observing System is an example that drives it from that perspective. It is easier then to link that, typically it's easier to link such an approach with stakeholders, because they are typically interested in a problem or in a process or something that is of concern to them. So as we are going through this question and answers, it would be good to have some perspectives on your experience with one or the other or both of these approaches, and where you see the best way forward to actually identify the essential variables for the Arctic, especially if they are extending from a global program into the high north. And that's the final short comment I wanted to make. In the past, the global programs, such as the World Ocean Circulation Experiment, the GLIVA program, SOLAS, many programs that came out of WCRP, IGBP, etc., global repeat hydrography, they stopped either at Fram Strait or at the Scotland, Iceland, Greenland overflows, sort of in these regions. And they just didn't extend into the high north. Sometimes, in my view, simply using the fact that it's more difficult to access ice-covered regions as an excuse to not want to deal with yet another part of the world ocean. But that's my own take on having been involved in many of these global programs that did not reach into high latitudes and the reasoning for it. Part of it might also be that people simply, did not want to get into adaptation of the observing methods from, a straight sensor deployment to something that's more complex. But I'll stop here. I think these were just a few thoughts to maybe get some input on. I think Vito.
Peter, I believe that from my perspective, if we continue to address the issue from the point of view of priority or the point of view of the problem, we can find a lot of inputs, different forces, and if you bring together different group of people, we can have a complete different solution answers. But okay, we about the concept of impactful and essential Arctic variables. So we can work to define criteria. So this is very general, is no refer to atmosphere or to a question or to ecosystem, but which should be the criteria through which we identify then the ARVO is impactful. So we can work on this. So the impactful and the scheme. So we are in the process to engage expert panels and advisory panel to provide inputs. But okay, which is the guidance? This is very important, more than priority. Then the expert panels will come with proposal. Then the scope of a group like SEON or guidance group will be to look the work and look if the results of this work made by the expert panel is in the line of what we are expecting, is in agreement with the final goal we like to achieve, and integration and coordination. So we should focus more, which is for us the criteria, the elements through which the expert panel do to identify the essential variables. And so to provide the guidelines, because I believe so. How much need to be connected with the social benefit to a specific application and needs, the number of stakeholders and users. So we need to select the criteria, the elements through which we identify an impact, the impact of the essential.
It's a great point, Vito. But I think Jan-René just put the slide up. That is one of the slides in the presentation of the roads process, which is sort of the framework in which this is being discussed. And there is actually a sort of a list of criteria for the essential Arctic variables.
This is general, but
it is general, right? But it's a starting point.
Okay. Don't see here any connection with. So at the end, the criticality achieving us a social benefit, what means then they list the social benefit area or the application, how this is connected, for example, with a framework exercise or the value tree. So this sort of function, transfer function, then otherwise these are very general words, then will be very difficult and any group can interpret in different way. So we need to define clearly the scheme and the model and the metrics, if I can to say, through which we identify them, and we will be able to, because we have the problem that essential variables can be very different. We will be some related to atmosphere or to the physical system. For example, WMO talk about physical system, okay? But they not consider biology. So biology is not physical. It's just biota is natural. Okay, so we have a lot of barriers and different culture and approach, and we need to manage all of them. So we need a very clear and well-defined, not just a few words and few categories like that. Too broad.
That's absolutely true, but part of what we can do as we are going through the exercise of, or through the sessions of Working Group 5, is we can add more specifics to it. But one of the comments that you made is simply characteristic of the global programs, that they are honing in on typically one domain. There are ocean programs, there are atmosphere programs, there are air-sea gas exchange programs. Some of them are a little bit broader, like CLIVA. But what we always had in mind designing the Arctic observing system is to cut across all these domains. And that makes it a very different observing system than most of the global ones. And the question then is, can some of the global ones cover part of what the entirety of the Arctic observing system would look like? I mean, one question that Vito brought up is, to which extent could this, or does this working group, or whoever is listening in right now, feel that part of what we are doing should be to get more specific in in spelling out what the criteria should be for the EAVs?
Looking at these slides and the thinking here and the sea ice variable that is often taken as an example. the idea here seems to be very specific because it talks about implementation through specific recommendation based on the best available technology and practice, and these are details on observations. But on the other hand side, what of the purpose here is also to, you would say, to identify the most impactful, we call them variables, but it may also be processes, also to ensure that funding is directed in the right way. And from that perspective, the more process oriented they are, the easier, I guess, will they be to understand from a funding perspective. So we are perhaps caught between, we need some specificity in order to meet our goals, but if we also want to make sure that we attract the interest of funders, we will need to do it at a higher level or at another level at least.
And that does seem to be a problem with the global programs to get the stakeholder buy-in, because sometimes it's a bit too abstract. It is easier if you are going by theme. And Vida, I fully understand your point. And I asked Molly, you were probably on the call, you were part of the session, and I asked Molly, how does she actually navigate these two sides? On the one hand, to work with stakeholders and be theme driven and sort of design the observing system based on that, but at the same time also making sure that certain baselines and certain observables are repeated at the same time, the same way, with a specific temporal resolution. And she sort of, she responded that within the Arctic Ocean Observing System, there are certain elements that are repeats that are more akin to what you see along typically see along the global observing systems, and others are much more variable, such as algae blooms, where you sort of have to adjust on wherever they pop up. You have to, you have to adjust your observations to that area and to the timing in the year and all that kind of stuff. So there is, as Jan-René said, that this is not a straightforward solution. That there is complexity in that question, and I think that is probably the challenge that we have here for Working Group 5, to figure out to which extent would an extension of global observing networks with their definition of essential variables, with their thinking about temporal and spatial resolution into the Arctic, help build that Arctic observing system that clearly needs some other elements in addition to that, but also, is much more focused than some of the global observing systems on stakeholder buy-in and on societal benefits.
Sorry, can I follow up on that? This is Anna. I just wanted to say that in the Working Group 1, we have discussed a very similar problem, identified a very similar challenge, but sort of from the different perspective. And what we were talking a lot about was how much within the roads process do we want to have a bottom-up or a top-down approach? Because thinking of variables, we definitely want them to be representative of the broad interests of different stakeholders, and interests of particular research groups do not always necessarily match with, for example, coastal communities. And yeah, it seems important that variables are representative, but also top-down approach seems to be working if we're talking about resources and coordination, because to make that effective, we sometimes need communication on the higher level. So yeah, ideally, we need to find balance between the two and have bottom-up approach with identifying initiatives and interests from the community, but then somehow coordinating resources from the higher levels.
And did you have any kind of insights, or was that at this point stating the problem but not yet having had the time to work through it to see how that could be navigated?
This is something that we are going to address during the breakout groups tomorrow.
So Peter, just but we can fix the maybe René can scroll a little bit to have more in the center the example. Like looking to this CIs, I didn't see CIs volume, CIs depth, for example. Or what about what means land fast eye stability and trafficability? What means at the end when you are talking about measurements? I understand this, but then sometimes it's also difficult to understand which sort of measurements they are. Are you sure then all is what is necessary for navigation is included, for example, or for one? Even this example is not so defined in this way.
Yeah, good point.
I think.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, it's just that I think that what Sandy tries to document is, as we also discussed here, that see if I can find that slide. No, it isn't there. These thinking of CIs in these terms is much closer to the users than another that a more global network would look at. But this has to do with application of, it could be of using the CIs as your highway, and so that's where you need these and are much more critical than other ice measurements.
So you need another level where the CIs variables are well defined from the observation point of view, because yeah, I understand the point and understand the starting, but this means then any problem, any item can become even more difficult than it's.
I mean, we have a system that is more complex than many of the systems that are addressed by the existing global observing systems. So clearly, there's more spatial variability. In a certain sense, there's more spatial variability. There is a lot of temporal variability. There is a trend sitting on top of it, and it is in an area. You have the Arctic as a whole. You have people there. So if you look at, let's say, some ocean programs or some atmospheric programs, I think they're easier to capture. Here we are capturing all of these domains. We have ocean, atmosphere, we have sea ice, we have land ice, we have snow cover, we have the human domain. So that it is a different kind of observing system. And I think that led to some struggles from the very beginning when we try to design an encompassing, holistic observing system for the Arctic that covers all elements of change, including biology, biogeochemistry, etc. Now, the question is, and that is where this is actually heading, saying let's sort of look at what would be the most benefit from implementing such a system for society. The question is, does that work better? In some cases, I see that work better. In others, it is just very complex to figure that out. But what you see here is an attempt to go into the domain where you can say, if you take the middle part of that figure where it says sea ice variables, concentration, type, development stage, trafficability, that is really geared towards immediate benefit for those who are living with the ice, living on the ice, using the ice. And then the question is, would these observations also contribute to, let's say, a global climate observing system? To which extent? Or is it much more important there to have albedo, the annual variability in the extent, and things like that. So somebody brought up working group 1, because and working group 1, of course, is sort of focused on the essential variables. Where is the discussion heading in that group with respect to how to define them, and what kind of issues do we have, because we have to bring in variables not just from one domain but from the entire system. Don't want to put you on the spot, Anna, but do you have any insight to share where the discussions in working group 1s are going with respect to specifying EAVs?
Yeah, I'm sorry, that sounds like an excuse, but we really are focusing on this specifically tomorrow, on how to make the link between the AAVs and social benefits. And today we were more talking about the structured models, and so it Rhodes process and its framework and evaluating structured models. So we, specifically try to not spend too much time on defining variables today.
But I know that you have a process, we've seen that process where you have a Google form where you enter details about specific variables. Have you done that, or is that still to come within working group 1?
This is an exercise for tomorrow.
Okay, okay. Yeah. But that will end up with, you could say, a series of candidate essential variables, won't it? That's the outcome.
No, ideally we don't want to produce the list of variables. We want to sort of define a criteria of what makes them essential, what makes them important. But we will work with these specific examples within this exercise as well, yeah.
So you would add more specifics to the 3 criteria that we have seen, the more general ones, I assume.
I can't promise, but that's the aim for tomorrow.
Yeah, sure. So maybe we can refocus a little bit here, and because it is actually working group 5 is looking at the Arctic in the context of global observing systems. So where do you see opportunities that have been missed in the past, that have not been taken, to take a global observing system all the way into the high Arctic? I mean, I already mentioned 1 or 2 examples. We had these endless discussions during the World Ocean Circulation Experiment, where the decision was made to, and that was a relatively simple program in terms of observing key variables of the ocean, like hydrographic properties and oxygen and currents, etc. But the decision was made based on resources, saying if we want to cover the Arctic, we need icebreakers. We don't want to deal with icebreakers, so we are just drawing a line. And I think the line was drawn at the Scotland, Iceland, Greenland ridges. And in the Southern Ocean, that was a little bit easier because the ice is not so heavy. So some sections were run all the way to the Antarctic ice shelves. But in essence, it ended with what was called the section S4, which was at around 60-something degrees south. And it was partitioned into 3 sections around Antarctica, and saying, okay, whatever can be done further south is fine, but we are not taking icebreakers, we are not taking special ships, we are just trying to stay at the northern part of the ice edge. And we had the same with the repeat hydrography, we had the same with JGOVS, the joint global ocean flux study, we had the same with the solar surface ocean land study. And so if you're thinking about these programs and CLIVA now, where do you think we are simply making decisions based on resources, and where do you think there is a real issue in terms of not being compatible with the ocean, with the global ocean or the global observing system domain if we go into the high Arctic. And that could be ocean, atmosphere, could be anything, could be biosphere. Are there any thoughts?
Today we have a presentation. We have the first decision. We was looking how Aerogoose or WMO was working, no? And they define. They try to define the resolution, the time, no, the spatial and temporal resolution, the accuracy, etc. So we are able, if you like to join this global effort, we are able to make this. And Aerogoose, for example, was indicating that as they try to make this, to connect what is feasible with the optimal needs, try to find a compromise, no? And they was presenting some table in this sense. So but the problem is then in the Arctic are so few sometimes observation than to compromise with the existing problem means not to go ahead too much. So for sure we need to be a little bit more more ambitious for some parameter, mainly if you look to the Central Arctic. Yeah, but the only, I don't believe then we will be able to make the same exercise that WMO was done for, I think, 10, 15 years before.
Yeah, I mean, WMO and WCRP have done these exercises since a long time. But in the implementation, they stop short of going into the Arctic. And my question is, why don't they advocate more for that, for moving further north and covering the entire globe? They seem to define a process, but then not go through
the social benefit and application.
Peter, you're cutting in and out, at least on my side. I'm not sure, Jan Rene, do you hear?
No, you have the same issue here. Vito?
My computer is old and I'm sorry. So
now you're back.
Yeah, it's freeze. My screen is freeze. So I know that a few times. So sorry for that. Okay, now it's okay. Sometimes interrupt the screen. Okay, but I was like just to say then it's difficult to follow completely the global approach as Arctic, and we need to focus more on application and specific application to identify the specific case of the Arctic. So application should be the way to identify our scope in the global system.
But that then leads us back to a theme-driven application, problem-driven approach, rather than a global grid that we work down, right? And the question is then, how do we connect? How can we actually take advantage of each other's efforts?
But the grid approach is very good for, even at the global level, it's very good just if you look to the satellites. Even on the in tropical area or the middle latitude at the surface, it's not so easy. I don't know. I believe then we are a little bit also today was a little bit too much driven by the satellite community and satellite point of view.
I think a big issue here is harmonized approach for how we actually collect this data, because if we're not talking about satellites, if we're talking about in situ measurements, there are so many uncertainties about as to what parameters to measure and how to measure. So it is not only the spatial issue, but also like the data quality issue. And yeah, this is something that international collaboration definitely could address.
That's a good point, but I thought that, you know, we made quite a bit of progress with respect to normalizing the data quality. Not that it's something easy to do, but I think there was quite a bit of progress. You know, just looking from the ocean side, which is a fairly easy one, also could take the atmosphere. The standardization of the quality of the measurements of the recent Arctic Ocean sections was they were at the same level of quality as the global ocean sections to a large extent. Atmosphere, I think, is similar. To me, the question is more, and I agree, Vito, that it's not exactly a grid that we have for the global observing systems, but we typically have something like a pattern, either ocean sections or fixed stations that we sort of go back to and sort of extend a baseline into a time series or a 4D picture, whichever means you have to do that. It's still a question of how to relate what we can get from that to the Arctic, or maybe not. It's simply a question. Is it easier to try and, looking ahead, to try and extend some of the global programs into the Arctic to provide elements of an Arctic observing system, or is it easier to design an Arctic observing system based on the needs of people up there, based on the needs to understand that system as part of the global system, and then connect it back to the global data sets? I think that's sort of one, for me, that's one of the key questions that we are sort of circling around. And go ahead.
We can follow hierarchical. Are you familiar with the work made in PX? Do you know the Pan-Eurasian experiment, an action promoted in Finland, mainly by Marco Kuma and strongly connected with Russia and China?
Yeah.
There was a lot of work that they are trying to promote here, a sort of a hierarchy in the observing system. So to group the station at different levels depending on the approach, the parameter and the information they can provide. And so try to build the system this hierarchic way. There are a couple of papers published on this approach, but you can find the PPX website and see. Eventually, and this was specifically discussed and developed considering the situation that affect the Arctic and the subarctic area. So, and I know that also there is an idea from them to expand this concept on a global scale. I believe this hierarchy can be a way to be as much inclusive as possible and try to keep inside all the activity, the most part of the activity are producing, and move the question on how to share and better distribute the data that are at disposal. And so the data issue is very important from this point of view in organizing the whole system.
Do you have any other thoughts?
I just wanted to follow up on sort of global inclusion, something that we also discussed today, that maybe SUS and other South Ocean and Antarctic programs is something that we should look at and take into consideration. Thinking about the Arctic, it is not very similar conditions, but at least, there are quite a lot of instruments and measurements that developed for mid-latitudes that wouldn't work in the Arctic. However, thinking about Southern Ocean, there might be more similarities.
Yeah, I think the Southern Ocean is it's almost like a step in between, because it has an easier ice cover. It's less complex in terms. I mean, you don't have the human domain to deal with. I mean, there are a few stations, but you don't have really communities living there. But it is more difficult than the open ocean. So, or even if you look at the atmosphere, it has ice underneath. It's remote. It's cold. So I think there are lessons to be learned from that. And for whatever reason, it seems like in some aspects, the Southern Ocean Observing System is further along in terms of its integration. In others, probably not so much, but it's a good point to see what we can learn from each other if we look at the southern and the northern high latitudes.
If I could just call attention to a comment in the chat. Deborah Lynn says, salmon is declining globally. River ice measuring is critical to spawning salmon. Communities' food security are impacted by sea and river ice thinning, creating warmer water. Salmon traveling up the Yukon River in Alaska died off before spawning due to heat exhaustion, and the Arctic Village has seen salmon moving further north in search of colder water. I think this is connecting to some of the work that Working Group 3 on Indigenous food security is doing. Also, Vito, thank you for that link to the ATM project.
Yeah, that's a good example of what would you have to actually observe to see how the underlying conditions are changing and what that would mean for salmon in this case, but that also then feeding into food security. You know, what kind of parameters would have to be looked at and would have to be monitored. I mean, to this point, it seems like most of the interaction we have, and I think most of the logical connectivity is between Working Group 5. This group is with Working Group 1 because there is a lot. I mean, it's focused on thinking about EAVs, but clearly some of the drivers of the system would come out of motivations that are anchored in, let's say, Working Group 3, food system. But still would like to come back to sort of thinking about this relationship between global observing systems and the Arctic observing system as a whole. You know, did we miss opportunities to use the global observing efforts to help with the establishment of an Arctic observing system? Vice versa, are we tightly enough linked to put the data that we are collecting in the Arctic into the global observing system data sets to make it whole? What, you know, where are these? How does the connectivity look right now? And I mean, sort of an overall assessment is it's not very strong. The question then is why, and what could we do? What can we envision to do better moving forward? For example, do we have enough representation on these working groups that are thinking about global observing systems? Are they really thinking about the Arctic? Are they thinking about it, but then say that's too difficult? Let's just focus on the areas from the mid latitudes and low latitudes. So I think these are the questions that this working group is structured around. Let's see, there was a comment. Vito.
Yeah, he says that we need to, in the case of salmon, involve the hydrological community in designing an observing system able to monitor water temperatures and make, at least on a short time frame, a forecast of what will occur in the next season. Air temperature could be much less important than precipitation and snow distribution, perhaps. Interesting.
And that, of course, is the strength of the fundamental architecture of the Arctic observing system, right? It has observations in all the domains. There is a hydrological part, there is a cryosphere part, there is a land part, there is the biological system, the ocean system, the atmosphere. So it is, in that sense, easier to address if these pieces are linked to each other. It is easier to address questions like the salmon question or the the algae blooms and things like that. But we are always saying we don't have enough coverage in many of the subsystems of the overall system. And we are often pointing towards, we are also not connected to the global system. So in this working group, one of the questions is, and I think it's the key question, is there something that comes to mind easily with respect to connecting to the global system and gaining, and creating some gain for both the Arctic community and the global observing community? Or do we simply have to focus on getting our observations into the system? I mean, the sensors into the system, the data collected, derive products, make them available, make sure that they are useful for the stakeholders, thereby have societal benefits, and then figure out, to which extent we can actually get synergy with the global ones, with the global systems.
I suppose the answer would be something hybrid, something in between. Of course, we want to take as much benefit from the global observing system, what comes, for example, the standards. So we don't have to invent the wheels again. But then, of course, there might be, like in these sea ice variables, there might probably are something really specific for Arctic.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be added. But then we need to think about the standards. What is considered as a valuable observation?
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. It's also, the one question is that we have to answer: are the standards for everything that we observe in the Arctic necessarily the same as those that we use for the global system? In many cases, probably yes, but there might be some where it's not, and that's something to be worked out. But yeah, it is probably a hybrid, and then if we accept that, we would have to figure out how can we, as part of that hybrid system, how can we actually get synergy between global observing and Arctic observing. And one example, Heike, you mentioned, is sort of thinking about standards and data quality procedures and databases, that we are not separating the database, but everything goes into the same database eventually. I mean, in the past, it was World Data Center 1 and 2. Now we have sort of fragmented our data centers a little bit. So we probably have to think about how to make sure that this fits together as we go forward.
As an example of a global system, it would be relevant to ask these questions to Rodika Nisu from WMO, and we have her presentation hopefully again tomorrow. I see a lot of interest from for instance, WMO. They have a specific program called the Global Cryosphere Watch. It's of course nationally based, as everything WMO is doing, but I see a lot of interest. They know that they have to get into the Arctic also to maintain their own relevance. You can of course always discuss whether they're doing it for, you could say, for local to meet local needs, or if it's some more overall needs. But maybe we don't have to worry about that as long as they do the observations. You could say there will always be something about how frequent do they observe a specific phenomena, where do they do it, etc. And that there could be a conflict there where they have other goals. But I see many of these programs as very interested in the Arctic, but also having some of it is also organizational. A thing like WMO, they would like to take a global approach, I guess, so that one size fits all. But we all know that will not work in the Arctic. So at their structural side, they're also discussing whether they should have dedicated cold regions initiatives, or if they can, you could say, do with their global programs, their global way of doing things.
Go ahead.
If I can make a comment about, since I'm involved from Italian side in WMO. I represent Italy in the HE-PORS in the Committee for Polar Regions, and also I was engaged in this in the action to develop a regional climate center for Antarctica. So it's of course WMO is a big organization with a legal mandate and with a legal connection with a very huge organization that are the meteo services, but they also suffer from this big dimension. For example, if you look to the requirements for the snow depth, they need to reduce the request and adapt simply because so many meteo services are not able to provide and to respond to strong requests. And also sometimes you can have a strange situation. US service is one of the less producer of data for WMO, simply because the system they have on place is not react too much to Vigos on effect. And so when they move to the Arctic or the Antarctica, the situation is very complicated also because they have these members that act as very big actors. So WMO as organization is when come on from the global to the regional area, need to interact with the organization and with the body they are inside WMO. So it's not so easy for them to act as an organization. They are regulatory, so they provide rules and standards and procedure, and the member, when they approve, need to apply, but then the mandate is to the member to make the real work.
But what would be the the natural extension then? Would it be the Arctic Council? Is the Arctic Council not active enough, not strong enough, not penetrating on that? Because often it seems like if we are going to high latitudes from low latitudes, in a way we are not. I don't think we are limited at this point by design or by the sort of by knowing which observations are needed and where the gaps are. It often is the resourcing, and there you have often a disconnect where the resources are just not coming at the same level as they come for global systems.
By the end of the day, I think it is the nations, the Arctic nations, that are the operating that will do this at the operating level. The Arctic Council in its current form will not make recommendations or funding or something like that. It all will come back on the countries, the nations, individual nations.
That is true. I think you're right, Jan-René. But this is a heavy burden on these nations to come up with the resources to do that.
Yeah.
And that is where maybe the sort of the driving force behind the resourcing that WMO is for many of the global systems is just not there.
Following on that, Peter, can I ask a question? With regards to like actual implementation of global observing initiatives, has your group put a lot of thinking into sort of how to secure and sustain these observations in the very changing and insecure geopolitical climate that we have? Because with regards to the Arctic, like even with goose, there are in place discussions of Arctic goose, but they sometimes don't go forward because some countries would reject them. Same with like agreement on fishers in the high Arctic. So yeah, just have you thought about what we as a research community can do to overcome or sustain or somehow put forward the initiatives of global observing in the Arctic?
Well, I mean, to the extent that I can see the global observing systems that, the major components that are in place right now, I don't see them under immediate threat. Where I really do see a problem is to have them, to have them expand further north to the extent that it makes sense. And we have discussed that there are certain elements of the Arctic observing system that cannot easily be transferred to a global scale. So that if we leave that aside and we look just at some of the underlying ones that are the same. I mean, if I look at Arctic hydrography, well, there are different Rossby radii, but in general, you observe the same stuff. The problem is that part of it is under ice for most of the year. But I would have not seen a problem in principle to take, let's say, the World Ocean Circulation Experiment and what came from that, which was the repeat hydrography lines, which now is GoShip, to run that up into the Arctic. You just would have had to use, instead of a regular open ocean research vessel, you would have to have you would have to use an icebreaker. But we have done these sections with icebreakers. So but it was typically when these programs were discussed on a global level, the high latitudes were cut out, and typically it was because of the logistic difficulty and the related higher cost, but not because there is a principal problem to do it.
If you look at that, you could say at a bit of a higher level, you may have heard this thinking that we're working within the Arctic Science Ministerials, and now we're going toward the third Arctic Science Ministerial. And the request from the second one was to go to implementation of the sustained sustained observing, and could of course discuss what that means. But one aspect is, of course, to provide funding, to provide resources. But then you will always come back to the question: well, what should we fund? Where is the need? And the thinking behind this process is also, as I believe I said, if we can identify the most impactful, the most important, the most critical things to observe, a vehicle for the countries to put resources together through one mechanism or another, so that you could really argue that as a concerted action, you're now going into implementation, that you do observing of those most critical variables that are the most impactful.
And then, I mean, coming back to the Arctic Science Ministerial and resourcing, here you actually would have a way to say, that integrating into a global system would make sense, to say, we have to resource the global observing systems for some of the variables, ocean, atmosphere, cryosphere, definitely probably would have to think about the other ones. There's certainly some biodiversity ones, etc. We have to make them global, and so we have to invest into closing the Arctic gap. And one of the reasons, of course, is if you find justification to do it globally, and it's almost cynical then to leave the Arctic out, because that is where the most rapid changes at the highest amplitudes are taking place. So you really want to capture that piece in terms of how it is sort of interacting with the globe and what its dynamical role is. And that might be one of the recommendations. Not saying that will be definitely the case, but we could consider as a suggestion for recommendations for this AOS out of Working Group 5 to say, we have to put resources into the global observing system so that they actually cover the entire globe, including the Arctic. There are 5 messages.
Yeah, I was wondering if, given this conversation is starting to revolve around sustainability and resourcing, whether anybody would like to address the comment which came from Jackie about the Marine Biodiversity Observing Network and how it might play into filling that Arctic gap on observing, or how it could use the year of polar prediction to kind of jumpstart some of these things, which is a comment that came from Helen.
Yeah, it would be great to hear a little bit more about how they think about, this could be done, if they see actually a real opening in terms of ongoing discussions in steering groups, or if it is simply a thought that should be brought forward into the groups who are designing these initiatives. Helen, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure, I can, Peter. Again, apologies, I was late joining the call, and part it was a thought that I had, and I thought if I don't capture it in the chat room, then my thought will be gone by tomorrow. But if we're picking up the WMO presentation tomorrow, and I've forgotten the woman's name, but I was thinking I would like to hear some reference about a year of polar prediction, because I know that they had a special observing period within YOP, and I haven't heard any discussion about it, and it struck me as there must be some linkages. I just didn't know, so I was really just sort of trying to capture a thought, so I would make sure we raised it again tomorrow.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, and this is Jackie. I would just bring up that Sandy Starkweather and we have been working together on putting biological, like you have for the sea ice in there, and the roadmap and the decision tree analysis for the biological observing systems. So that is something that's in the works.
So do you see, Jackie, do you see that there will be a better synchronization with the global system?
I think so. I mean, because we have the Arctic Marine Biodiversity Observing Network and the Distributed Biological Observatory working in the Pacific sector. We're connecting that to the Atlantic through the Nansen Legacy, the Canadians, and so forth. But within that broader scope is the Arctic Council CBMP, the Circumarctic Biodiversity Monitoring, and that connecting to the Marine Biodiversity Observing, all these acronyms into the global system, or the GeoBond, the broad scale. So there's different, we're involved in various, more so virtual lately, but we were going to have a big meeting, but now to talk about taking that from the local, regional, Pan-Arctic to the global and make it more explicit. And so it's in the process.
Yeah.
You want
Yeah,
to
yeah. And I would just say, Peter, that we're working with Frank Mueller Carter and other people that are working at much lower latitudes in terms of trying to get the marine biodiversity observing networks, the pilot ones that have been started, including one in the Chuck GC, to work with the ones in Florida and California to try to meld together the essential biological variables.
Yeah, and I would just add to that is one of the things is it's very much temperate and tropical oriented for a lot of those variables. So putting the Arctic environmental, these essential variables is adding, like right now there's a macrobenthic, which isn't in the temperate ones.
And coral reefs.
Besides coral reefs and turtles and so forth. Marine mammals have been adopted now as an essential variable. And so just to broaden it, to allow these Arctic essential variables to go across latitudes.
I think that's great. And, this is probably one of the examples then that could be used to say, this is not going one way, but the global system benefits from having the high latitudes as part of it, but vice versa, the Arctic system does benefit from being part of the global system. So, we probably have to identify a few of, or we should identify a few of these examples to say, why is that really, in general, a benefit to both sides to gain this synergy? Because that's often what these individual, operators or proponents of these systems are asking. So why should we have the Arctic in there? It's just a pain in the neck. And, we sort of pointing out where it really benefits the overall enterprise would be nice.
That's right. I think you're right there, Peter. And I think this is a good chance to cross. We were on the observing the other working group 1, and it's trying to cross the different working groups within the Arctic Observing Summit is we're kind of bouncing back. But I think what you're suggesting right now and giving some case studies or example will really be a movement of roads, go down the roads more. Thanks.
So any other comments, thoughts, inputs? And we don't have to use the last 15 minutes if we feel that we have exhausted the exchange.
I would like to invite Vito to expand upon his comment in the chat about the Europolar prediction connection with this discussion mainly being a demonstration of the relevance of extended observation can have in forecasting at different timescales. If you would like to expand upon that, Vito.
Yes, the scope of YOP was mainly not to make this special observing period, so to explore the needs to ameliorate forecast, not only short forecast, but a different time scale from the meteorological forecast until the climate forecast. And so the special observing period was an attempt to make for short time, because this was possible to have more observation, for example, 1,000 more radio soundings, and to see how this can impact on the modeling. And so to connect observation modeling was very important. So this is a very great contribution that YOP could provide, because can becomes a clear demonstration of the benefit that you can obtain in several applications. And now YOP is in consolidated phase. In the south hemisphere, probably we will have another special observing period in 2022, but for the Arctic, they are closing the field activity and now are much more interested to connect observation with the modeling. Was also developed a protocol to try to simplify the transfer of observation in the model, and etc. So this can become a very good example of advantages, very clear and very, very concrete from this point of view. And with respect to example of connection between lower latitude observing system and Arctic, I need to say that in Europe we have this research infrastructure initiatives. We have a community about environmental. There is ENVRI, in which SIOS is connected with a infrastructure like ICOS or ACTIS, etc. They also have a station into the Arctic. So there is a place where the different community share information and try to discuss together how to develop the system on a larger scale and spanning along the latitudes. So there is another place where this debate is very easy and is started yet.
Okay. Great, thanks. Seems like we have gone through the comments. I don't see any other hands up. What do you think, Jan?
I agree.
So I would say we close it here, except somebody has another parting thought. You know, we will continue these discussions clearly through the next day, and then the synthesis, it will go into the synthesis on the following day, the last day. Looks like everybody, there are no further questions. So Jan, do you want to close it out?
Yeah, thanks for attending. Thanks a lot.
Yes.
Talk again. I think
Thanks,
Michael.
everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
So if anybody is interested, there's more information on the next events at the AOS2020agenda.org website. A recording of this will be available there. And just to remind everybody, the next event of AOS 2020 will be at 4 a.m. UTC, and that'll be the panel on perspectives on observing needs focused on Indigenous private sector and science needs. So I hope to see a bunch of you there. Thank you so much, Renee.
Thanks
And
for your help. Thanks
also,
a lot.
yeah, thank you to everybody. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.
Bye,
Michael,
thank
I
you.
have a practical question. That the group chat here, is that recorded together with the session as such? Is that captured somewhere? The chat?
I'm not sure if the whole chat, but I can save it and send it to you if you'd like.
Yeah, that'll be great. I appreciate that.
Will do.
Okay.
No problem. And so now you can hit stop on the recording for our, sorry, what was your name one more time?